Good morning, everyone. I'm Chapman. I'm originally from the Midwest. I grew up as a St. Louis Cardinals fan and I moved to the Boston area 4 decades ago now and started going to Red Sox games. And I would be sitting in the stands, sipping a beer and with a friend, and I'd see fights break out in the bleachers, and I would ask my friend, I went to Cardinals games for years and years and years, and Cardinals fans are so nice. You probably heard the stories about how in 2004, when the Sox were on the verge of breaking the 86-year drought, that Cardinals fans leaving Game 4 were giving their tickets to Red Sox fans standing outside. And what's even more amazing was the ushers at Busch Stadium were letting the Red Sox fans come in and see. I said, people in the Midwest are just so nice. What's going on? And the guy says, well, it's a small stadium, half the size of Busch Stadium. We're all crowded together, very small seats. These seats were put in there back when Babe Ruth was playing. And you have a couple of beers out in the bleachers and you get feisty, basically. And so he kind of said to me, you're not in Kansas anymore, Dorothy. And, So after a while, I became a connoisseur of bleacher fights as you're sitting there and you're drinking a beer and eating a hot dog. And the one rule I learned was never punch up, always punch down, because the guy in the row behind you has an advantage. And I absorbed that lesson, but unfortunately I didn't absorb it well enough to put it into place before I started litigating the issue of school choice back in 1993, because, and I'm going to explain where all this is going, is that I'm going to give you a couple ways to attack something like a constitutional amendment like we have here and as there are in other states, which is if you're litigating, you're basically punching up. If you have legislation in place, you're punching down. So I'll rewind now to the history, which was back in 1993, I was approached by a number of groups, Catholic, Jewish, African American, Pioneer Institute, libertarians, a very broad and diverse coalition. And they said, we want to do something about this anti-aid amendment. And I knew a little bit about it from basically 6th grade religion class, if you can believe that. And if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and if you're a lawyer, everything looks like a lawsuit. So started to think about this in terms of a lawsuit. And there had just come down a Supreme Court case called Romer versus Evans in Colorado, which involved a constitutional amendment that was passed that prohibited local towns from adopting basically protective measures to protect homosexuals. And the case was decided that you can't single out any single group for legislation. That offends our basic constitutional notion of equal protection. And you can't make it harder for any one group to petition government for redress of grievances. That's a basic denial of equal protection. So I said, I think we have our case here. I think we have our pattern. And so we went out and we got really the perfect plaintiff. She was an African-American woman. She was not Catholic. She was evangelical Christian. She had 2 daughters, and every year she would alternate. She would send one to public school and one to Catholic school, and then they'd switch. So one daughter went through 1st, 3rd, 5th, and 7th grade in the Catholic school, and the other went through 2nd, 4th, 6th, and 8th. And her reasoning was, I want my girls to get at least half of a good education, because if I send them to the public school, they're going to get in fights, and they won't learn. The kids are disruptive. The teachers don't teach, so on and so forth. So she really was the perfect plaintiff. So we started our lawsuit based on the Romer versus Evans theory, which I still think is a good theory. And we went all the way through the district court here and through the Court of Appeals and all the way up to an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court decided not to take the case after we had lost in the district court. This was shortly before Justice Alito joined the court. Had he been a member of the voting justices, we probably would have gotten the 4 votes. But anyway, so there we are 8 years later, basically, and and this is why I'm calling that punching up, which is at the end of that 8-year slog, you can end up with nothing. And In the meantime, our plaintiff, Pat Boyette, had died. Her daughters had gotten out of the school system, and so you end up basically having, bought the lottery ticket and getting nothing. So my perspective on all this is if you want to punch down, you need to get legislation passed. And we had tried many times during this period to get various bills passed that we thought would be a good litigation magnet for somebody else. We tried to get the equivalent of a educational IRA account passed that could be used for any school, parochial or public. And we tried to get tax credits, both refundable and non-refundable, passed. But the response was always from the legislators we talked to, that's unconstitutional. So all that changed in 2002, and I opened up the time capsule for you people and brought you the Boston Globe headline from June 28, 2002, which was the decision in the Cleveland Zellman versus Simmons-Harris case, which basically said the fact that a government program benefits some members of a religious community or some religious institution doesn't make it constitutionally defective. So my perspective, once again, is that if we could only succeed here in Massachusetts in getting a bill passed, first of all, getting legislation passed helps people. It helps people in the real world as opposed to litigation where the thing drags on for years and years and everyone is always asking you, what's going on, when is the judge going to rule, and there's no actual human being being helped. But you can't say that after Cleveland anymore, even though the anti-aid amendments are basically on a different level of government than the Constitution, the U.S. federal constitutional amendments that were at issue in the Simmons-Harris case. So I know that's hard. We speak to legislatures. We tried a lot of ideas. They're very leery of the politics of the situation. As Ray Flynn said, if you can get everyone together on this, I think we could get something passed. There's a number of disparate communities that have come together in the past, and if they saw a chance of success, maybe they would come back together again. The third alternative, and I spent some time on the south side of Chicago, as our president did, and I learned a little about Saul Alinsky, the infamous or famous, depending upon your point of view, community organizer. And one of his principles is hold your opponents to their principles. And if you can't pursue litigation, if you can't get legislation, I suppose the obstructionist view that I've always advocated, but I can't get anybody to pick me up on it, is we currently have a constitutional amendment that says no public funds may be spent in any institution that is not under the control of the government. But every year, and I pulled a budget listing from a couple years ago which shows grants of $100,000 going to the Boston Symphony Orchestra, six-figure grants going to museums, $50,000 grants going to avant-garde drama groups that I submit plays to. I mean, I don't think they need the money, personally. But my favorite, my all-time favorite, I happened to be over in the State House one day on something else, and I was sitting in the gallery when hearings began on the National Music Center, which was going to create a home for aging rockers in Massachusetts. And it was a beautiful show. I mean, they had the audio visuals down, they had the video, they had a very presentable speaker, they had sob stories, of course, of rock stars who had lost all their money. And I'm sitting there in a gallery going, is somebody going to say anti-aid at some point, but in fact, it actually went through. And then, so after the fact, of course, the thing crashes and burns, as many enterprises that involve rock stars do. And I'm feeling like I'm looking at the bill at an expensive restaurant now. There was a $2.5 million grant from the Executive Office for Administration and Finance, $585,000 from the Department of Housing and Community Development, $50,000 from the State Department of Economic Development, $285,000 from the Massachusetts Port Authority, and $240,000 from the Massachusetts Turnpike Authority. And you look at stuff like this and you just go, okay, we can give money to somebody who made a couple albums and then sucked all his earnings up his nose, basically, or bought a Maserati and crashed it, but we can't give money to kids in K through 12 schools. And somehow I think we have our priorities wrong on that, and I hope this event inspires some of you perhaps to restart the fire that we tried to light back in 1993, but had extinguished by a Supreme Court case. So, thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for having me here today. I stand before you a proud product of a good Catholic school education. I may not look like it, but believe it or not, I am. My parents, I chose my parents wisely. I chose parents who valued education and had enough money to live in an expensive district in southern New Hampshire that had a great K through 12 public school education. But it was a small town, it didn't have a high school. When we had moved there, the our school district had an arrangement with a neighboring town that had a fantastic public high school. But by the time I had gotten to 8th grade, that contract had expired, and they had entered into a contract with a different town with a very different type of public school that my parents weren't terribly thrilled about me attending. So we started to investigate other options, and though we weren't Catholic, I had some friends that from the public school system that were going to a Catholic school, and persuaded my parents to send me. Now, while I was there, I had a wonderful 4 years. They were just great to me. Nobody ever tried to convert me or anything like that. And I think that I'll be eternally grateful for the tolerance and respect that this Catholic school and the people who work there extended to me. And I can't help but think that a part of the reason that they behaved that way toward a religious minority in their midst was because of the history of Catholic education in this country, of Catholics being a religious minority in the midst of a Protestant majority. In the 1800s, public schools were de facto non-denominational Protestant schools. These schools taught the Bible, they led students in prayer, and they did so in a way that pretty much any Protestant, be they Methodist, Congregationalist, Episcopalian, could send their students to that school and know that they were going to pray and learn the Bible in a manner that was consistent with their Protestant views, and they would save the finer points of their particular theology for the afternoons or for weekends. But obviously this didn't work for Catholics, never mind the non-Christians that lived in the midst. And so Catholics established their own schools where they learned the Bible their way, where they prayed their way. And at a certain point, they began asking for public funding. After all, they were sending their tax dollars to pay for the Protestant school. It was only fair that a proportional amount of their tax dollars paid for their own children to attend school. But the Protestant majority said, oh, no. Our schools are common schools. Our schools are public schools. They're open to anybody. You're welcome, of course, to send your children to our schools, but what you're running is a parochial school. Parochial, of course, being a euphemism for Catholic. And we don't want parochial, we don't want our tax dollars going to fund parochial education. Now, people say, well, today things are different. In those days, the Protestants wanted the Catholics to go to their schools because they wanted to Protestantize these students. They didn't like the idea that these immigrants were coming over from Germany and Ireland and France and bringing with them Romanism and rebellion. And so they could educate all that stuff, this papism, right out of them. But today, this is not a problem anymore because we've secularized the public schools. And they're not teaching Bible anymore. As a matter of fact, they're not even teaching it as an academic subject, as one of the pillars of Western civilization, but that's a speech for another day. They're not praying in public schools anymore, so we have secular public schools that are open to everybody. That's true to some extent in theory, but not in practice. There are still many people, Orthodox Jews, devout Muslims, certain evangelical Christians that simply a public school education won't do for them. But take religion out of it for a moment. Imagine this hypothetical. You have a town, and the town is populated by 3 different groups. You have Vulcans, Wookiees, and Hobbits. You may have an indication of how I spent my youth. So the Vulcans are the majority of the town, and so the school system reflects Vulcan values and preferences. They take off Vulcan holidays, they sing Vulcan songs, they emphasize Vulcan culture. Now, of course, the Vulcans are ecumenical. They're going to teach a few Hobbit songs. They'll sing the Ballad of Bilbo Baggins. For the Wookiees, they'll take off May the 4th, Star Wars Day. I know there's a lot of Catholics in the audience. You know the response, may the Force be with you, and also with you. Good Catholic school education, see? So the Wookiees and the Hobbits in the town say, well, wait a second, we want to take more of our holidays off, not just one day a year, and we want to sing more of our songs. We'd really like to run our own schools that reflect our values and our preferences. And the Vulcans say, no, 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 we're running a common school that's for everybody. I mean, in this hypothetical, you can see how ridiculous the Vulcan argument is. It's the same as the argument of the Protestants of, 150 years ago, 200 years ago. And it's the same argument that's being made today, without the explicit anti-Catholic bigotry or any anti-Jewish or anti-Muslim bigotry. But it's still an absurd argument. It's an argument where the majority has this myopic view that their values and their culture is just open for everybody, and they don't recognize how other cultures and traditions that want in their formative years to immerse their children in their own way of educating their children, it simply does not work for them. And so the public school system is by nature a political system. A political system is a zero-sum game. It creates winners and losers. It forces citizens and neighbors into conflict with each other in order to have their preferences represented in the public school system, and some of them win and some of them lose. It fosters social conflict. A system of school choice fosters social cooperation. You can have your schools that work for you, we'll have our schools that work for us, especially for minority groups, right? And now there's this fear, of course, of balkanization, but if 2 centuries of Catholic education has taught us anything, it is that private religious schools can produce good citizens. And the research backs this up. There was a research review, a compilation of studies a few years ago called Civics Education, published in Education Next magazine. This is a project of Harvard University's program on education policy and governance by Dr. Patrick Wolf. A review of 21 different studies that found that private schools outperformed public schools in terms of political tolerance, volunteerism, political knowledge and participation, social capital, civic skills. It was really quite phenomenal. These private schools are not balkanizing and producing children that grow up not to be good citizens, that are, that don't work well with or that discriminate against other people. It fosters citizens that are more knowledgeable about our civic institutions, that are more likely to participate in them, and most importantly, more likely to extend political tolerance to other groups with whom they might disagree. So the sort of programs that foster this, that allow people to have their preferences met, are things like voucher programs, which we have in 15 states and Washington, D.C., education tax credit programs, which we have in 17 different states, including New Hampshire and Rhode Island, and education savings accounts, which exist in 5 different states. And the research not only shows that these produce citizens that are more engaged and more knowledgeable, but they also produce superior students. We have more than a dozen random assignment studies. And this is the gold standard of social science research, right? Just like in medicine, you take a group of people, we randomly divide you in two. This group we're going to give a drug. This group we're going to give a placebo. We measure the difference between the two groups, and whatever the difference is, that gets attributed to the treatment. So likewise, when you have a voucher program, there's a lottery. If there's oversubscription, we can compare the students that applied for a voucher and by random chance got one versus those who applied and randomly did not. And the overwhelming consensus, or near consensus anyway, is that voucher programs, school choice produces students that perform better on standardized tests, that are more likely to graduate high school, that are less likely to be engaged in crime, that are more likely to graduate college. In other words, that produce the sort of life outcomes that we are looking for. So if we want this sort of system, if we want a system that fosters social harmony, that fosters better students, more politically engaged students, that allows parents to match their students to the schools that best meet their needs and that reflect their values and their educational preferences, then we need school choice programs. And for that, what we need to do is we need to eliminate or remove the Know Nothing Amendment from the Massachusetts State Constitution. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Grace Cotter-Regan, and I serve as the head of school at St. Mary's in Lynn. And I want to thank Jim and Jamie and the work of the Pioneer Institute. This is all new to me the past couple of years. I'm in the trenches, so it's always nice to have folks thinking about policy and pushing us in the trenches and as educators to think outside the box. The superintendent was here last year at this forum. I am not representing the Archdiocese of Boston. I'm representing St. Mary's as a Catholic leader at St. Mary's. And I want to acknowledge the great leaders here. Ambassador Flynn is one of my heroes, and was a contemporary of my father's, who is a lifelong educator. They both grew up in South Boston in Savin Hill and played against each other and worked tirelessly for those who seek justice and who deserve justice, meaning underprivileged students, kids who might come from the projects, or students at BC High who would not have received that education without the tireless people like my dad and Ray, who really helped them to grow and achieve their preferred option for life. Much like Ambassador Flynn, my grandparents were immigrants and from Ireland, and they instilled in us an importance of faith in education and opportunity. And they always said to us that if you want something, you have to sacrifice. So my parents and my grandparents made great sacrifices for us to have a great education. We came from very humble means. We didn't have much growing up, but we had everything because they believed in us. We had a loving environment, faith-filled life, and opportunity because they believed in who we were. I'm the product of Catholic education, 12 years of Catholic education, and I had the privilege to go to Boston College. My husband and my children are also the product of Catholic education. One son went to Bowdoin, not a Catholic college, but the other went to Stonehill. And I say that because I really love the choices that we had and we made. And we sacrificed mightily for our students, for our sons, financially, but I believed in it, and I believed in a faith-based education. I really feel that they had an opportunity that we sacrificed for, and I would do it all over again. We live in the city of Boston, we live in West Roxbury, so we made some choices. And I now serve, as I said, as the head of school at St. Mary's in Lynn. As a leader of a Catholic school, I embrace the national Catholic standards and benchmarks. I look at my role as a vocation. I really feel called to what I do and to help our students. We focus on mission and identity, governance and leadership, academic excellence, and operational vitality. For St. Mary's, our students in Lynn, it's about access and affordability. For those students we have always served, it's about finding a way to make the opportunity of a St. Mary's education a possibility for our students. We draw from 30 cities and towns. We draw half of our population from the city of Lynn, where students have options. They can go to Lynn Classical, Lynn Tech, Lynn English, or the Charter KIPP Academy. We have 30 international students in our school, and I share that by way of just our complexity, because if you came to St. Mary's, you would know we had international students. It's a global inner-city urban school, and our students, some are blessed, some are more blessed, some are not, and they all have the same opportunity to succeed. Our students and families have many options, and the financial commitment for us is often the reason whether they come to St. Mary's or not. I spend the lion's share of my time fundraising and working on enrollment. We're really committed to our academic outcomes, and we've just embraced a robust study of our academic data, creating an academic dashboard. And I share that because sometimes Catholic schools, when you ask people, how do you measure your success? Oh, our students go to the best schools. Well, we have embraced the kind of idea that the public schools have done in terms of looking at data, measuring ourselves against the public schools, making sure that we differentiate ourselves, but also that we really are true to who we are and who we serve, and providing the best opportunities for our students. And the competition has changed over the years. You know, I'd say 10 years ago, if you asked someone like me, who do you compete against, I would probably say the Catholic schools on the North Shore. But today, our students, we compete against the charter schools, the public schools, the independent schools. There are many, many different options, and everybody is looking for students. The demographics have changed, as we know. Catholic school population has been down nationally. We're probably down 2 to 3% on the archdiocesan level. The feeder schools have been dramatically impacted by some of the new models, the 6 to 12 models, some of the charter models, and also the Catholic models who have gone 6 to 12. So those traditional students who might come to a Catholic school aren't there. So it's hand to hand trying to get students to commit. And often for parents, you might say Catholic is the deciding factor. It really isn't. I was just with my board chair the other day, and he shared some statistics from the Friedman Foundation. The top reasons parents select private or Catholic schools: better discipline, better learning environment, smaller classes, improved safety, more attention. Catholic isn't in the top 5. So why go to a Catholic school? Well, for me, I think a faith-based school is amazing. We have some freedoms at the Catholic school that allow us, again, we talked just about prayer. I just kept thinking about Game of Thrones when you were speaking. I don't know why. But we can, we pray, but we also, can teach some of our gospel values day to day, which I think is really important. And I look at gospel values as just being good people, doing the right thing. I come from a Jesuit background, and I always think about being a person for others, committed to a faith that does justice. And that's something that is my moral compass and drives me every day. So as I said, the competition has changed. And I think for our students, for anyone these days, the biggest challenge is access, opportunity, and affordability. For a family that might have 3 children, how do they afford a Catholic education, a private Catholic education, and then send those kids to college? So what happens for me is I have to say, what can I do for this student? How can I help them afford St. Mary's, but also how can I help them achieve their preferred option for college or university? And along with that, how do I help them find those financial opportunities to succeed at the next level? And will they finish in 4 years? So for us, those are the kinds of things that we benchmark against, and it's really important. What gets me up in the morning is the impact our school has on the lives of our students, helping students who are blessed and those who may not be as blessed. That is kind of my vocational joy. And in closing, I want to say I support school choice and vouchers to help students achieve their preferred option. It's all about opportunity and affordability and access, and I think we all deserve that. Thank you.
Good morning. It's great to be here. If you want to move a portrait, you have to move people. And you move people when you move them with a purpose. And oftentimes you move people with a purpose when you give them something to have what I call a political pause. My first political pause as it relates to school choice actually occurred in the 1970s when I was a kid in Los Angeles, California, at a Catholic school. I went to Catholic schools from grades 1 to 12. In fact, since this turns into Catholic School Idol with all of us who are part of the Catholic school community, Catherine Drexel's order founded the Catholic school that I attended in the first grade, the same school my mother went to, my aunt, and my uncle. And so I remember one day my parents having a conversation about Catholic school tuition, of course, which we paid. And someone mentioned, well, you know what? We're being double taxed. We're paying for the Catholic school in Los Angeles, and we're paying for the public schools down the street. Now, be very clear, my parents were in no way anti-public school. They were just pro-Catholic school. And I went, So we're paying for me to go to Catholic school, same for my sister, and we're paying for Randy and Marcus, all of my friends in the neighborhood to go to public schools. Nothing's wrong with that, but for the first time I went, So I fast forward to 1991. I'm now a 5th grade school teacher at a private school in Los Angeles, one that was actually located 6 blocks from where I attended elementary school. And lo and behold, a gentleman from the Midwest had come to our school to get parents in what they call South Central Los Angeles to sign a petition to get vouchers on the ballot in 1993, which someone in here knows quite well. I said, I'll be honest, I've never heard of a voucher. He said, it's real simple. You get public money to give to parents to pay for education at that time at a public, but more importantly, a private school. I had my political pause, and here's why. A week earlier, one of my favorite students had to leave school. Her mom and dad chose to be a one-income couple, and with that, resources were limited. We tried to change where we could, tuition, some work, and one day they had come into the room and said, Brother Gerard, we just can't pay tuition any longer. So I had my political pause because someone like Randy could have actually benefited from a voucher. So I said, this voucher thing kind of makes sense. Next political pause, 2004 to 2006. I'm at Marquette University, another school that the Catholics like. We're in the middle of what I call a Lift the Cap campaign. It is 2205. The Milwaukee voucher program is now 15 years old. Oldest, largest urban-based voucher program, although not the first. And it was time to lift the cap. We were at 15,000 students. What most people don't realize is that while in 2005, we had a lot of religious schools that were involved. But in the early years, in fact, when the first voucher law was passed in Wisconsin for Milwaukee, there were no religious schools allowed. Because they said, no, we can't use religious money to give to religious, or public money to give to religious schools. That's against Thomas Jefferson's concept of church and state, although many of us know that Thomas Jefferson, of course, was in France at the time. They were debating the nuances of what we know as the First Amendment. We also know his idea about separation of church and state is found nowhere in the Constitution, was a letter, mentioned in a letter that he wrote to Danbury Baptist in Connecticut. And we were finally able to raise the cap. But it took a lot of political pauses. It took regular people whose children were in public schools, but who thought helping low-income kids were important. It took them to say, they are paying for my kid to go to a public school. And my public school kid, in fact, goes for free. Some of the schools are actually great. But some of the kids' schools that those kids are attending are great, some not so much. I think it actually makes sense to give them some of their own public money to move forward. The political pause number 4 for me occurred in the state, or I should say better yet, the Commonwealth of Virginia. We fortunately now have a tax credit law in Virginia, but it took a major push. And we worked with a number of attorneys. Khan mentioned that he worked here in Massachusetts. We worked with the Institute for Justice and a few other lawyers. And they said, your Blaine Amendment is going to make it really tough to have a voucher. So we'll give you a tax credit. And in many ways, tax credits has become what I would call the substitute for a full-blown voucher. It's the better of having something than nothing, and it also sets the playing field. But we had one of our really, let's say, successful school choice days in Virginia. And it was ecumenical, and there was a number of people who had come together. And one of them said, you know what? This is the first real school choice rally I've been to in Richmond during a time when we have a capital legislative session, where all of us stopped and said, you know what? We're going to make this happen because it's right for families and it's right for kids, and plus it's their money. Somehow shifting it to beyond just parents and kids, but it's their money. And here's the last and final political pause. It happened today. When the ambassador mentioned 1855 and he mentioned President Lincoln, I, in fact, had never heard of that quote he used. I'd heard some things about the Catholics, but had not heard some things about the Negroes, which today have moved from Negroes, coloreds, blacks, now African American. But what was interesting is I remember when we debate trying to help low-income kids, particularly those who are African American, Hispanic, and others, we oftentimes go back to Lincoln, the great emancipator. And if in fact, as Khan say, that we want to hold people accountable to their principles, when we talk about school choice, let's hold people accountable to their principles, particularly some of our liberal friends. I have to remind them, when did it become unpopular for liberals to give poor people money? Particularly their own money. And so no better commonwealth/state makes sense to drive the next movement for school choice than Massachusetts. You've always been an innovator. You've always been a bellwether. If we want school choice to work, and it calls for us to move a portrait, then we have to move a portrait by moving people. And we move people by giving them a purpose. And the best way to move people with a purpose is to give them a political pause. And so when we talk to our friends and others, we are using public tax dollars that public people have used for a greater public purpose. By doing that, we can have them make the political pause, and after political pause, we can have a political victory. Thank you.
So if you have a couple of quick questions, we have a little bit of time for that. Anybody have any questions they'd like to ask of any of the panelists? Please. Anybody want to take that?
One of the early critiques of school choice was, in fact, that you would open up the door of opportunity for bigots, for extremists, and others to be involved in the choice movement. You happen to mention Islam. In 2005, when we had the Lift the Cap campaign, there were actually Muslim schools and leaders, teachers, and parents who were involved. These were not, this would have been, of course, pre what we have today, but these were people who were Islamic. Automatically they weren't terrorists. There are things that states can do and have done to actually address what you're mentioning with charter schools. Number one is when you have a charter school application, those who are responsible for vetting it oftentimes take a look at who are the founding members. Number two, where their funding coming from. Some of it is public, but some of it is also philanthropic and outside. Third, you take a look at the mission. And fourth, you make sure it's in place. What happened in Turkey, I told a friend of mine, I am sure that someone's rightly going to raise the question that somehow we should now question whether school choice is safe and sane. Remember, you had a lot of extremists involved with public school then and now, long before, and no one per se wanted to call for the closing of that, and not saying that you're doing that. But there are smart ways through authorization to address that. But I want to say that's an old argument, 25 years removed, vouchers, charters, tax credits, tax deduction, and now ESAs. Those things have been minor.
Any other questions? Please, Lisa. Did you hear the whole question? Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but basically the question is, how does this work, school choice, with separation of church and state? What's that? Right, okay, so specifically school choice that, when a voucher is going to a parochial school. So first of all, I'd say this, that actually before the common school movement in the 1800s, it was private education. Almost all of the schools had some sort of a religious bent, and they were publicly subsidized. So Catholic schools actually, at a certain point in this country, and Protestant schools were getting public subsidies, and then with the rise of the common school movement, they said, well, these schools are for everybody, and we're not doing parochial education anymore, especially as the Catholic schools began to proliferate. But this was a decision that came down in, which I believe Con mentioned earlier, Zellman v. Simmons-Harris in 2002. So the Supreme Court said if the program has a legitimate secular purpose and that the entanglement with religion is only incidental, that this isn't a problem. Okay, so every person gets a voucher, and then they can choose whether they want to take that to a secular school or a religious school, or which type of religious school. Nobody is forced to go to a religious school. No money is going directly to a religious school. And the Supreme Court said, look, this is no different than you might give food stamps to somebody and they use it for a religious feast. They might use it for the Passover Seder. You can give housing vouchers to somebody, Section 8, and they might have a weekly Bible study in their house. You could give people Medicare and Medicaid, and they can go take it to a Catholic hospital that has a crucifix in every single room and has a priest on the staff. And that none of these are a subsidy of religion. All of these are subsidies of individuals so that they can get their food, their health care, their shelter, and their education. And that any benefit to religion is incidental to the choices of individual recipients. Follow up? Sure. Yeah. Right. Right. Right, so the money has to go direct to the individuals, and individuals have the free choice where to spend it. The money can't go directly to these religious institutions, with a few exceptions. So in certain states, for example, they'll subsidize transportation for all students. So they'll subsidize security or technology for all students, but they're not going to subsidize the instruction at a private school directly. But they will give a voucher, and that can be spent, however the school spends it. Right.
David, if you have one quick comment, please. David, one second.
One of the things that we confronted was that very question, and one of the things you would require a voucher is that religious schools fund their religious instruction with their schools. That is the way around.
In 1964, the 1916 Elementary Secondary Education Act allows private school money to be used at public schools or Catholic schools, religious schools, because of development. We also have Title I for low-income kids. So that's been going on for a long time.
Okay. To respect your time, let me just give a couple of quick closing thoughts here. First and foremost, remember that we also have a higher education system that does benefit from scholarships, and we are the envy of the world. No one ever thinks about taking away a scholarship from a child because that young adult decides to go to a Catholic school or school with another affiliation. What I took away from Ambassador Flynn were many things, but it boiled down to people matter. You matter. Everyone in this room matters. That someone can set a fire in another's heart by taking action. Khan talked about punching down and making sure that we have a strategy that's not just based upon a lawsuit. Jason talked a lot about outcomes around its civics, not just education, that it's character. He talked about Vulcans and Wookiees, which I don't understand. Different generation. Grace talked with real grace about one thing, and that is, what I took from it was not just how St. Mary's thinks about it, but you hear often in the public school realm too often that poverty is the issue. A vocation drives that school. A vocation that covers academics, the soul of the child, faith-based education, and doing it for kids who are disadvantaged. And what I took from Gerard was, you gotta move people, back to the ambassador's point, but you do it with a purpose, and you have to create moments where there's a pause, when that person reflects on what it means for real individuals. Let me tell you one little bit of information, and Jamie Gass has been leading this work for us, and we're deeply appreciative for your work on this. We are producing a documentary with the support of many of the people in the room. That is going to be a fabulous documentary about the Know Nothing movement to be released this winter. It will tell the story of bigotry and violence in 3 different locations in the United States, and real-life stories of people who are impacted adversely by that. You'll have a national release. It'll be done digitally. We've become pretty expert at this stuff. And this is to drive a way to touch people, real people who've been affected, to create that pause that Gerard talked about, so they reflect on it. We look forward to getting that out and sharing it with you, and for having you share it with your friends also around the country. Thank you very much for being here today. We appreciate it.